Welcome to Top 10 Secret, where we uncover the creepiest and most terrifying ghost stories, from haunting curses to unsolved mysteries, with the most chilling of all being the curse of the Black Tomb. A ghostly tale that will send shivers down your spine. Story 1. The Curse of the Black Sepulchre. The town of Ravenshade had always whispered about the forsaken graveyard at its edge. A burial ground untouched by time, where the dead never truly rested. For centuries, no one dared to venture there after dusk, for the legend spoke of the Black Sepulchre, a towering tombstone that loomed over the graves like a monolith of doom. It was said to be the prison of a being so malevolent that even death could not contain it. One stormy night, a group of thrill-seeking strangers arrived in Ravenshade. Among them was Jonathan Whitmore, a historian obsessed with unearthing the town's hidden past. Against the frantic warnings of the townsfolk, he and his companions made their way through the gnarled, dead trees that guarded the graveyard's entrance. The air was thick with decay, and the sky above churned with swirling black clouds, as if nature itself recoiled from their presence. Jonathan had spent years collecting stories of haunted places, and the Black Sepulchre had become his greatest obsession. His research indicated that Ravenshade had once been a thriving town until something happened centuries ago. Something that left it cursed. The few records that remained mentioned an ancient burial ground where an unspeakable entity had been sealed away. Lightning cracked the heavens as they approached the Black Sepulchre. The ground beneath them felt wrong, soft and shifting, as if something writhed beneath the soil. Inscribed upon the tombstone was a name long eroded by time, but as Jonathan wiped away the grime, a guttural whisper filled the air. "You should not have come." The earth split open. Decayed hands, blackened with the corruption of centuries, clawed their way from the ground. The very soil seemed to bubble and churn, birthing grotesque figures with hollow, soulless eyes. Their skeletal fingers reached, desperate and relentless, pulling at the living, eager to drag them down into the abyss. Screams filled the night as one by one, Jonathan's companions were swallowed by the unholy tide of the dead. He turned to run, but the shadows themselves conspired against him. A force stronger than anything mortal seized his limbs, dragging him backward toward the towering sepulchre. As he struggled, he saw it. The being, the one whose name should never be spoken, now freed from its prison. It rose, towering over the chaos, its form shifting and writhing with the agony of 1,000 lost souls. Hollow sockets burned with an unnatural fire as it reached for Jonathan, its claws sinking deep into his chest. Pain unlike anything he had ever known consumed him as he felt himself unraveling, his flesh dissolving, his essence becoming one with the abyss. Jonathan did not simply vanish. His screams echoed through the night, reverberating across the town of Ravenshade, where the villagers locked their doors and prayed they would not be next. The sepulchre pulsed with newfound energy, its once ancient inscriptions glowing with an eerie, malevolent light. Weeks passed, then months, and Ravenshade grew quieter than ever. Travelers avoided the town altogether, and even those who had lived there for generations began to flee. But some, drawn by curiosity or ignorance, continued to disappear. The Black Sepulchre, once dormant, had awoken, and its hunger was insatiable. The ground surrounding it had become unstable, its presence spreading like an infection. The air carried the scent of decay, and those who wandered too close swore they heard whispers calling them by name. Then came the night of the storm, the night when the sky turned black as ink and lightning struck the ground with unnatural ferocity. The graveyard, long abandoned, seemed to breathe. The tombs trembled, the earth swelled and cracked, and from beneath the Black Sepulchre, something stirred. A figure emerged, Jonathan Whitmore, or what was left of him. His eyes, once full of ambition, were now hollow voids. His skin hung loose and rotted, yet something stronger than death sustained him. He was no longer merely a man. He was the voice of the dead, the harbinger of the curse. And behind him, crawling forth from the pit of damnation, came the others, the souls claimed by the sepulchre, their forms twisted and grotesque, forever trapped in endless suffering. They moved as one, their wails forming an unbearable symphony of torment as they spread beyond the graveyard, creeping into the town itself. By morning, Ravenshade was no more. The streets lay silent, the homes empty. The only sign of life was the shifting fog, rolling through the deserted town like a shroud. And at the graveyard's edge, the black sepulchre stood taller than before, pulsing, growing, feeding off the souls it had consumed. Jonathan's fate was sealed, but his suffering had only begun. Trapped between life and death, he was doomed to wander, forever bound to the entity that now controlled him. His voice could be heard in the howling wind, his shadow glimpsed at the edges of vision, a warning to those who dared to come too close. There is no record of what happened to the last of the villagers. No one speaks of Ravenshade anymore, for those who do often meet untimely ends. But the legend persists. Travelers still whisper of a graveyard swallowed by time, where the earth moves unnaturally and the wind carries the cries of the damned. And when the storms come, when thunder cracks and lightning strikes, some say you can still hear the whispers, calling for the next to join them in the eternal darkness. Story 2: The Haunted Carriage. In the remote town of Black Hollow, whispers of an ancient legend echoed through generations. The townspeople lived in the shadow of an ominous tale, a story of a cursed carriage that roamed the desolate roads when the night sky was bare of moonlight. Cloaked in an eerie mist, the black carriage would emerge from the fog, its arrival heralded by the chilling clatter of hooves against cobblestone. The lantern swayed gently, casting flickering shadows of faceless figures trapped within its darkened interior. Few had ever claimed to see it and lived to tell the tale. Those who did often vanished without a trace. Others were found the next morning, eyes wide open, lips frozen in silent screams of horror. Their hearts had simply stopped, as if something had wrenched the life out of them in one ghastly moment. No priest or doctor could explain the terror etched upon their lifeless faces. One man, however, refused to believe in superstitions. James Whitmore, a skeptical journalist from New York, had made his way to Black Hollow after hearing rumors of the cursed carriage. Seeking the next great story to cement his reputation, he scoffed at the warnings given by the townsfolk. An elderly woman, Edith Morrow, the oldest resident of Black Hollow, clutched his wrist with an unsettling grip before he departed into the night. "Son, you must not go searching for it," she warned, her voice trembling. "It is not a carriage. It is a harbinger of doom. If you see it, it will be too late." James chuckled, dismissing her caution as mere folklore. Armed with his notepad, a lantern, and a revolver for good measure, he ventured toward the forest path where the carriage was last seen. The air grew colder, and an unnatural fog slithered across the ground. It was as if the very earth exhaled an unseen malevolence. Then, it came. The rhythmic clopping of hooves pierced through the stillness. A figure emerged from the mist, its form growing clearer with each moment. The black carriage, grand and archaic, appeared before him, its horses eerily silent. The carriage doors creaked open, revealing an abyss of darkness within. A voice, deep and reverberating, called to him from the void. "Step inside. Your fate has already been written." James found himself unable to move, yet something pulled him forward. His body betrayed him, his limbs defying his desperate will to flee. The moment he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut with a deafening finality. Inside, all sense of time and space dissolved. James was enveloped in blackness, weightless and disoriented. Whispers slithered through the void, echoing from unseen mouths. "Help us. Please, help us." A clammy hand brushed against his shoulder. He turned and saw them. Hollow-eyed specters, their faces twisted in agony, surrounded him. Their translucent forms flickered, barely clinging to existence. "You will never leave," they whispered in unison. James let out a scream, but the darkness swallowed it whole. His skin began to fade, turning translucent, his body merging with the shadows. His very essence was being consumed. He was becoming one of them. The next morning, the townspeople discovered James's abandoned lantern and notebook on the road leading into the woods. But there was no sign of him. Years passed, and Black Hollow remained shrouded in fear. Travelers spoke of a black carriage that sometimes roamed the roads, its eerie lanterns swaying with an unnatural glow. Some even claimed to have seen a man inside, a young journalist with hollow eyes and an expression of eternal horror, trapped forever in the doomed cycle of the haunted carriage. But that was not the end. One fateful evening, a drifter named Thomas Grayson arrived in Black Hollow. Unlike James, he was not merely a journalist. He was a man who had spent years chasing the supernatural. The legend of the haunted carriage fascinated him, and he vowed to uncover its truth. Equipped with charms, candles, and an ancient book of exorcisms, Thomas ventured toward the forest where the carriage had last been seen. He marked the ground with protective sigils, setting up his lanterns in a wide circle. He had read of such cursed objects before, and he believed that he could banish whatever entity lurked within the carriage. Midnight struck, and the air thickened with an unnatural presence. The distant clopping of hooves signaled the approach of the ghostly vehicle. As it materialized from the fog, Thomas steeled himself, chanting words of protection. But something was different this time. The carriage did not stop in the center of his circle. It did not open its doors. Instead, the horses reared, and the carriage driver, a cloaked figure whose face was hidden in darkness, turned his hollow gaze toward Thomas. A chilling voice echoed through the trees. "You cannot stop what is already written." Thomas barely had time to react before the lanterns flickered and extinguished. The protective sigils burned away as if erased by unseen hands. The fog thickened, swallowing Thomas whole. He was never seen again. The legend of the haunted carriage lived on, claiming souls one by one. It was not just a curse. It was an entity beyond time, a force of endless torment searching for its next victim. And so, the carriage continued its journey, eternally searching for its next passenger, bound to the shadows for all time. Story 3. The Crucifixion of the Damned. The sky above the wasteland churned with dark clouds, swirling in chaotic spirals as if the heavens themselves recoiled from what lay beneath. The land was a sea of jagged rock and smoldering embers, where rivers of molten fire coursed through the cracks of a broken earth. In the midst of this infernal landscape stood an enormous crucifix, its wooden beams blackened and rotting, as if soaked in centuries of suffering. Nailed to it was no ordinary man. His flesh was stretched taut over sinewy muscle, his face twisted into a nightmarish grin of agony and delight. Two immense horns curled from his skull, casting eerie shadows upon his gaunt visage. His eyes, black as the void, bore no soul, only the abyss staring back. The crucifixion was not a punishment. It was a coronation. The demon's name, once forgotten, was now spoken again. Lucian Graves, a man once devout, betrayed by his faith, twisted into something unholy. The chronicles of his existence were buried deep in the forgotten pages of history, but his name had never truly died. The world had long awaited his return, though none who walked the earth remembered why. The land of the living had long since abandoned their gods, and now the gods had abandoned them. A cathedral stood in the distance, broken spires jutting into the sky like shattered bones. Once a monument to the divine, it had become the heart of a new faith, a faith built on despair. At its steps stood the high priest of the unhallowed, William Dorn, a man who had long forsaken the light, his tattered robes soaked in the blood of those who had dared to resist. He raised his arms to the sky, his voice like thunder as he called forth his master. He who was cast down shall rise again. He who was bound shall be unchained. Through suffering he is anointed. Through pain he is crowned. Let the heavens tremble, for the Black Messiah walks once more. Lucian's mouth twisted into a grin, his body writhing as the nails that bound him began to shake. The sky cracked open with a chorus of unholy voices. The ground beneath the forsaken army trembled as black ichor dripped from his wounds, seeping into the earth and corrupting everything it touched. The bodies below convulsed, their flesh splitting as something new clawed its way out. Grotesque beings, their forms twisted mockeries of their former selves, their mouths stretched open in silent screams of rebirth. The dead no longer lay dormant. They had been called. With a sickening creak, the crucifix began to shift. One by one, the nails that had bound Lucian in place were pushed free, not by hands, but by the sheer force of the darkness within him. His arms fell to his sides, the broken wood of the cross splintering as his body moved. The sky grew darker still, the flames of the earth rising higher as he took his first step down from his throne of agony. A hush fell over the infernal congregation. The abyss itself seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. Then he spoke. The war is not over. It has only begun. With those words, the ground beneath them all shattered, and the world of the living trembled as the first cracks of hell split through its fragile surface. The hour of reckoning had come, and no god above would stop it this time. The darkness spread like wildfire. Cities fell overnight, their people reduced to husks as the corruption took root. The sky, once blue, became an endless void. Churches stood empty, their altars desecrated by creatures that slithered forth from the cracks of reality itself. Those who survived whispered of Lucian Graves' return, of his army of the damned sweeping through the land, consuming all in their wake. The dead no longer remained in their graves. They rose, joining the ranks of the fallen, marching beneath the banner of their unholy king. The world fell silent, and then the screams began. Entire nations crumbled, civilization ceased, and at the heart of it all, Lucian Graves stood, his hollow gaze watching as the world burned, as the final remnants of humanity were wiped from existence. His laughter echoed across the void, a sound so chilling that even the gods above turned away. And when the last light of the mortal world flickered out, he raised his arms once more, calling his legion to him. They answered, their voices rising in an unholy hymn as the earth split apart beneath their feet. For this was no mere conquest. This was the end of all things. And in the ruins of creation, only Lucian Graves remained, his throne of bone and shadow stretching into eternity as the universe itself faded into darkness. Story 4. The Curse of the Hungering Shade. The village of Black Hollow was a place few dared to visit, its name whispered only in hushed tones. For centuries, it had remained abandoned, shrouded in an eternal mist that coiled through the gnarled trees like grasping fingers. The ruins of old homes lay scattered, their skeletal remains jutting from the earth like the bones of forgotten corpses. But the true horror of Black Hollow was not in its decayed buildings or the silence that choked its streets. It was what lurked within the darkened woods beyond. Legend spoke of a being known only as the Hungering Shade, a creature neither living nor dead, cursed to roam the land in endless starvation. It was said that those who wandered too close to the village at night would hear its raspy, inhuman breaths from the trees, and if they were foolish enough to stay, they would vanish without a trace. One fateful evening, a group of travelers found themselves stranded near Black Hollow. A storm had forced them off their path, their carriage broken on the jagged stones of the forest road. They had heard the stories, of course, but desperation drove them forward. Rain lashed their faces, and the wind howled like a chorus of the damned. With no other options, they took refuge in the ruins of an old inn, its rotting beams groaning under the weight of time. As the fire sputtered to life, casting flickering shadows along the walls, one of the travelers, a man named Elias Carter, noticed strange markings carved into the wooden beams. They were deep and jagged, as if made by claws rather than tools. His unease deepened when he found what appeared to be human bones in the hearth, charred and brittle. "We shouldn't be here," Elias muttered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "This place is cursed." But his warnings fell on deaf ears. The others dismissed his fears as paranoia. They bolted the doors, stoked the fire, and tried to drown out the howling wind with drunken laughter. But as the night deepened, something changed. The laughter faded. A thick, unnatural silence settled over the room. Then they heard it. A sound like dry leaves scraping against stone, slow and deliberate. A wet, rattling breath just outside the door. The travelers froze as the door creaked, as if touched by unseen hands. And then, from the darkness, a voice rasped, a voice that did not belong to the living. "So hungry." Panic surged through them. Elias grabbed a fire poker, his knuckles white. Another traveler, a woman named Marjorie, stepped toward the door as if entranced. Before anyone could stop her, the door burst inward, and the thing stepped into the firelight. It was tall and impossibly thin, its leathery skin clinging to its bones like a corpse long since drained of life. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, rows of jagged teeth glistening with saliva. Black pits where eyes should have been bored into them, and its clawed fingers twitched with anticipation. The Hungering Shade had found them. Chaos erupted. The beast moved with unnatural speed, lunging toward Marjorie before she could even scream. Its skeletal fingers dug into her flesh, and in mere seconds, she was nothing more than a husk. Her body drained, her eyes sunken and lifeless. Elias and the remaining travelers ran. They burst through the back door, stumbling into the storm, the wind howling like a chorus of tormented souls. Behind them, the creature gave chase, moving on all fours, its elongated limbs propelling it forward with horrifying grace. One by one, they fell. The creature moved too fast, too precisely, its hunger unending. Their screams were swallowed by the storm. Elias ran until his lungs burned, until his legs could carry him no further. He collapsed at the edge of the forest, his body trembling, his heart pounding. Then, silence. He dared to look back. The creature stood just beyond the tree line, its mouth still dripping with the remnants of his companions. It did not follow. It simply stared, as if savoring the fear that radiated from him. Elias never returned to Black Hollow. He spent the rest of his life warning others, spreading the tale of the Hungering Shade. But the world had forgotten. And one night, years later, as he lay in bed, a chill seeped into his bones. From the corner of the darkened room, something breathed. So, hungry. The villagers found his house empty the next morning. The only thing left was the lingering scent of decay and deep claw marks on the walls. Black Hollow remains abandoned, and at night, when the wind howls and the mist thickens, some say you can still hear it, waiting for its next meal. But the legend does not end there. With each passing year, reports of disappearances grew. The Shade's hunger was unending, its reach spreading beyond the cursed village. Some say it has learned to travel with the storm, hiding in the shadows of forgotten alleys, slipping through cracks in reality where the weak-willed wander. In cities and towns where no legend of Black Hollow existed, bodies began to vanish without a trace. Claw marks marred bedroom doors, bed sheets left twisted in frantic struggle. And those who had the misfortune of surviving long enough to speak whispered of a gaunt figure standing at the foot of their bed, whispering that same dreadful phrase, "So hungry." One final entry was found in Elias Carter's old journal, discovered decades later in the ruins of a farmhouse miles from Black Hollow. It knows, it learns, it spreads. It does not need the village anymore. Now it follows the fear, and if you are reading this, then it has already found you. No one knows who wrote the last sentence, but the ink was still wet. Story 5. The Curse of the Witch Queen. Deep within the accursed forest of Blackmoor, where the trees clawed at the sky like skeletal fingers, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the fog-laden ground, there stood a wretched figure of legend. Known only as Morgatha the Witch Queen, she had haunted the nightmares of villagers for centuries. No one knew exactly how long she had lurked in the shadows of the ancient woods, but the stories whispered of a time when she had walked among men, spreading her foul magic and weaving curses upon those who dared defy her. Legends told of her grotesque appearance, her long, bony fingers tipped with crimson claws, her twisted grin lined with yellowed fangs, and eyes that gleamed with an unholy fire. Draped in ragged robes, she wielded a staff adorned with the skulls of those who had fallen victim to her dark sorcery. She was the harbinger of death, the mother of nightmares, the architect of doom. The villagers of Blackmoor lived in perpetual fear of Morgatha. Those who wandered too deep into the woods never returned, and those who spoke ill of her were found days later, their bodies contorted in agony, their faces frozen in expressions of unspeakable terror. Some claim to have seen her shadow moving through the trees, her voice carried on the wind like a deathly whisper, calling them by name. One fateful night, a foolish man named Thomas Grayson dared to enter the forest in search of proof of the Witch Queen's existence. Armed with a silver dagger and a lantern, he ventured forth, scoffing at the warnings of the elderly. He believed the stories to be nothing more than the ramblings of frightened villagers, desperate to keep their children from wandering into the dark. The deeper Thomas traveled, the more the forest seemed to close in around him. The air grew thick with the scent of rot and decay, and the distant sound of whispering voices sent chills through his bones. His lantern flickered violently, its flame struggling to stay alive against an unseen force. Then, without warning, the wind died, and an eerie silence fell over the woods. A figure emerged from the shadows. Morgatha stood before him, her wicked grin stretching impossibly wide. "You seek proof, foolish child?" Her voice croaked, like the rasping of dead leaves. "Then you shall have it." Thomas tried to run, but the ground beneath him writhed like living flesh, roots curling around his ankles like the grasping hands of the damned. The lantern shattered as he fell, plunging him into darkness. Cold fingers trailed across his face, and the sound of hollow laughter filled his ears. When the villagers found him the next morning, He was alive, but changed. His hair had turned ghostly white, his eyes vacant, his lips moving in ceaseless whispers. He spoke only of the Witch Queen, of her eternal hunger, of the horrors she had shown him. He could not sleep, could not eat, could not escape the visions that plagued his mind. And then, one night, he disappeared, leaving behind only a single message scrawled onto the walls of his home in his own blood. She is coming. The fear spread through Blackmoor like wildfire. The villagers fortified their homes, hanging charms and burning sage to ward off the curse. But none of it mattered. Morgatha's presence had been summoned back to the world, and her hunger was insatiable. One by one, the villagers began to disappear. Some were taken from their beds in the dead of night, their blankets left behind, stained with the scent of decay. Others were found wandering the roads in a trance, whispering her name before collapsing lifelessly to the ground. Those who tried to flee never made it past the village's borders. An unseen force pulled them back, as if Blackmoor itself had become a prison of Morgatha's making. Desperation turned into madness. Those who remained refused to speak, refused to step outside after sunset. They left offerings at the edge of the woods, bones, blood, anything they could give to satiate her. But the Witch Queen did not want gifts. She wanted souls. The final night of Blackmoor was one of sheer horror. The sky turned black. The wind howled with voices that were not of this world, and the trees bled a dark, viscous substance. The village burned as an unnatural fire spread from home to home. Yet no one screamed. No one could. Their voices had been stolen, their bodies twisted into gnarled husks, their eyes replaced with dark, empty pits. When the sun rose, there was nothing left of Blackmoor but ash. And in the center of the ruins, standing among the smoldering remains, was Morgatha. Her grin wider than ever, her eyes burning brighter than before. She had finally feasted. And as she turned her gaze toward the next town, her voice slithered through the wind, carrying a chilling promise. Your souls will be mine. From that night onward, no map bore the name Blackmoor. The land where it once stood became cursed ground, a place of perpetual darkness where no life could grow. But some say on nights when the moon is full and the air is still, a whisper drifts through the trees, calling for the next unfortunate soul to step into the forest. And those who do never return. Story 6. The Harvester of Pain. In the frozen wastelands of Black Ridge, where the snow was tainted with the stains of forgotten battles, there lurked a being whispered about only in fearful prayers. He was called the Harvester, an ancient entity of torment who feasted on agony and despair. His form was grotesque, a towering figure of sinew and exposed muscle, his flesh impaled with countless wooden spikes, each one said to contain the suffering of a soul he had devoured. His crown of bone jutted out like the antlers of a forgotten god, and his grin, oh, his grin, was lined with teeth like shattered glass, hungry and endless. Legends told that the Harvester did not kill his victims outright. No, his pleasure was in the slow unraveling of their minds, the peeling away of their humanity layer by layer. He would appear in the depths of winter, when the cold gnawed at bones and the wind howled like a chorus of the damned. He would come to those who were desperate, who had wandered too far from the safety of the villages, seeking shelter or salvation. When he arrived, the snow would turn black and the sky would bleed a sickly red. The wind would fall silent, as if the world itself held its breath in terror. The most infamous tale of the Harvester was that of Nathaniel Grayson, an experienced hunter from Montana who had ventured deep into the Black Ridge to chase a stag of unnatural size. The locals warned him against it, their eyes shifting nervously toward the tree line as they spoke in hushed tones. But Nathaniel was a man of reason, not superstition, and he laughed off their concerns. With his rifle slung over his shoulder, he disappeared into the endless white. 3 nights passed. On the 4th morning, Nathaniel returned, but he was not alone. He stumbled into the town, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken and brimming with madness. His once proud hunting gear was torn, his hands trembling as if something unseen gripped him. The townspeople surrounded him, demanding to know what had happened. And then he screamed. It was not a scream of fear, nor of pain. It was something deeper, a sound of absolute and complete surrender, as if his very soul had been flayed open. He fell to his knees, clutching his chest, and with a guttural sob he began to change. Wooden spikes erupted from his skin, piercing through flesh and bone as if he were being molded into something else. His jaw dislocated, stretching unnaturally wide as black ichor dripped from his mouth. His fingers elongated, splitting open to reveal additional writhing tendrils of sinew. The townspeople screamed and fled, but it was too late. The harvester had chosen his heir. Nathaniel's body twisted into something beyond human comprehension, his screams morphing into laughter as he rose from the ground, his transformation complete. The ancient curse had claimed another. The town burned that night, its people dragged into the ice, their suffering etched into the ever-growing collection of spikes that adorned the harvester's cursed form. The stories did not end there. Years passed, and the legend grew darker. The harvester's influence spread beyond Black Ridge, infecting neighboring settlements. Entire towns vanished, their homes left abandoned, doors still ajar as if the residents had simply walked into the night and never returned. Hunters who dared step into the accursed land reported seeing grotesque figures lurking just beyond the edge of the trees, their bodies adorned with spikes, their mouths muttering in voices that did not belong to the living. A scholar named Dr. Michael Calloway, an occult historian from Chicago, became obsessed with uncovering the truth. He gathered a team of explorers and set off into the frozen wilderness, armed with ancient texts and forbidden knowledge. He believed the harvester to be an ancient god, a manifestation of pain itself, one that could be bound if the right rituals were performed. They were never seen again. A diary was later found, half buried in the snow, pages frozen together with frost and blood. It contained the final delirious writings of Dr. Calloway. He is no god. Gods demand worship. He demands suffering. I have seen the faces of those he has taken, their mouths stretched in silent screams, their eyes pleading for an end that will never come. He is not bound by time. He is not bound by mercy. He is hunger. He is pain. And he is watching. The final page contained only 2 words, written in frantic scrawls. He waits. And now, when winter comes and the wind falls silent, travelers claim to hear a voice calling from the trees, a voice that sounds almost human but not quite, a voice that promises salvation in the cold, a voice that never lies, for it brings only the truth of suffering. And those who listen too closely are never seen again. The harvester does not rest. He does not forgive. And as long as there is suffering in the world, he will always find his way back. Story 7. The Blood King's Throne. In the heart of the forgotten empire of Dreadmore, buried beneath centuries of war and legend, there sat a ruler whose name had been cursed in every tongue. His name was Victor Sable, known to history as the Blood King. His reign was not one of diplomacy or reason, but of conquest and slaughter. His throne, an abomination of flesh and bone, was built from the remnants of those who had dared to defy him. Skulls, rib cages, and broken limbs fused together in a grotesque sculpture, whispering the agony of their former owners in the cold silence of his great hall. It was said that Victor had never known defeat. He led armies into battle not as a man, but as a force of nature. His blackened armor, adorned with the remains of his victims, bore the scars of 1,000 battles. Yet no blade had ever pierced his flesh. His soldiers feared him as much as they revered him. For to fail him was to become another piece of his dreadful collection. The Blood King's palace loomed over the kingdom like a mausoleum of the damned. Great spires of obsidian jutted into the sky, and within its halls, torches burned with an unnatural blue flame. The walls bled in places where the souls of the fallen had been sealed within, their cries muffled beneath layers of cold stone. The throne room was a cathedral of horror. Corpses lined the floor, twisted into grotesque poses of eternal suffering. The stench of decay, iron, and burnt flesh never faded. But even the strongest tyrant cannot rule forever. On the eve of his 100th conquest, an old woman was dragged before him. An oracle, dressed in tattered robes, her body frail, yet her presence unwavering. Unlike the countless rulers who had knelt before him, she did not beg for mercy. She simply raised her head and spoke words that chilled the chamber. The throne you sit upon will betray you. The bones will reject you. And your name shall be erased from history by the very hands you have slaughtered. Victor laughed, his voice a deep, guttural echo in the grand hall. No prophecy has ever ended my reign, witch. No blade has ever pierced my skin. No god dares touch my throne. The oracle did not falter. She only smiled, revealing teeth that were far too sharp for any human mouth. It is not a god that comes for you, Blood King. It is something far older, something you have fed with every soul you have taken, and it is waking. That night, the palace trembled. The bones of the throne cracked, a deep groan reverberating through the chamber as if the very foundation of the castle had begun to breathe. The walls pulsed, veins forming in the black stone, pumping a thick, viscous liquid that smelled of rot. The air thickened with whispers, voices not of the living, but of the countless souls Victor had condemned. The following nights, his soldiers disappeared. Guards stationed outside the throne room were found days later, their bodies twisted in ways that defied human anatomy, their jaws locked in silent screams. The torches flickered, their flames shrinking as an unseen force drained the light from the room. Victor remained unshaken. He was the Blood King. He did not fear death. He was death. But something else stirred beneath his throne. The bones shifted. The skulls at his feet began to move. Hollow sockets glowed with a faint, sickly light. The whispers turned into growls, then into shrieks. The throne, his mighty seat of power, began to rise, not by his command, but by its own will. And then it spoke. You have sat upon us for too long. You have fed us for too long. Now we feed upon you. The throne consumed him. His armor was stripped from his flesh as unseen hands dragged him down, his body pulled into the writhing mass of bones. He screamed, a sound unlike any he had ever made in battle, a sound that shattered the very walls of the palace. His own bones snapped and reformed, his body stretched into something inhuman. The faces of the dead began to manifest upon his skin, their mouths locked in endless suffering. The Blood King had become one with his throne. By sunrise, the grand palace was empty. The torches had all been extinguished. The kingdom, once ruled with iron and fire, fell silent. And upon the throne sat something new, a creature neither living nor dead. a fusion of flesh, bone, and pure agony. Its eyes burned with the suffering of thousands, its voice now a chorus of the damned. The Blood King was no more. Only the throne remained, and it was hungry. Story 8. The Curse of the Black Veil. The sea was restless that night. The waves churned under a blood-red moon, and the wind howled like the wails of the damned. The sailors aboard the Black Veil clutched their rosaries and muttered prayers, for they knew that their voyage was cursed. No man dared to speak it aloud, but they all felt it. The presence of something unnatural lurking within the hull of the ship, whispering in the darkness. Captain Jonathan Mercer was a man feared across the 7 seas. His reputation as a ruthless pirate was well earned, for he had plundered countless ships, spilled the blood of kings and common men alike, and taken treasures beyond imagining. But there was one treasure he should never have touched. A blackened chest pulled from the depths of a wrecked Spanish galleon, its surface covered in ancient eldritch runes. The crew had begged him to leave it, to cast it back into the abyss from whence it came. But greed had long since hardened Mercer's heart. He pried the chest open with his dagger, revealing its contents. A chalice of obsidian, carved with the faces of screaming souls. The moment his fingers brushed against it, the ship trembled as if the ocean itself recoiled. From that night on, the Black Veil was no longer a vessel of men, but of something far worse. It began with the whispers. Soft at first, like the rustling of wind through torn sails. Then, the voices grew louder, speaking in tongues no man could understand. The crew began to change, first in mind, then in body. Their eyes darkened, their skin grew pale and sickly, and their voices carried an echo of something inhuman. Then came the deaths. One by one, the sailors disappeared, only to return as something other. Their flesh hung from their bones like tattered sails, their eyes empty voids. They did not speak, nor did they bleed. They only obeyed. Mercer fought against the curse with all his might, but it was too late. The ship was no longer his. It belonged to the abyss. The mast cracked and groaned as it carried them further into the unknown, into waters no map had charted, where the stars above twisted into unfamiliar shapes. Days turned to weeks, though no one aboard could count them. Time itself became meaningless. The ship wandered through an ocean black as ink, beneath skies where no stars shone. When they passed another vessel, no matter how near, no one aboard ever saw them. The Black Veil had become a ghostly specter, sailing unseen in the veil between the worlds of the living and the dead. Mercer, though doomed, refused to surrender. He searched the ancient texts he had stolen over the years, hoping for some way to undo what he had unleashed. Yet every passage, every incantation led to the same conclusion. There was no escape. The chalice was not a mere artifact. It was an anchor, a prison for an ancient force that no man should have disturbed. And then, the whispers turned to screams. The crew, what was left of them, collapsed to their knees as unseen hands clawed at their flesh. The deck pulsed as if alive, veins of darkness spreading across the planks. And then the thing in the chalice awoke. A figure emerged from the obsidian chalice, its form shifting like smoke, yet solid as bone. Its face was featureless except for a mouth filled with endless rows of jagged teeth. It did not walk, it did not move, it merely existed, its presence alone unraveling reality around it. Mercer tried to fight. He swung his blade, but the moment it touched the figure, his sword rusted and crumbled to dust. The entity turned to him, and in a voice that shattered the minds of those who heard it, it spoke. "You are mine now." Mercer screamed as his flesh dissolved, his bones turning to ash. His spirit was ripped from his body, shackled to the ship, his very essence bound to its cursed wood. The Black Veil did not stop sailing. The ship became a myth, whispered among sailors as an omen of doom. Those who glimpsed it would soon vanish without a trace. Their vessels found days later, drifting empty upon the waves, their crews gone as if they had never existed. Some say Mercer still stands at the helm, his hollow eyes staring into the void, his soul forever trapped in the cycle of torment he had unleashed. The crew, their humanity long devoured, wander the ship as shadowy phantoms, bound to serve the entity that claimed them. And when the mist rolls in and the sea grows silent, sailors claim to see it, a shadow in the distance, its black sails billowing without wind, carrying the souls of the damned toward an eternal nightmare. Pray you never hear the whispers of the Black Veil, for those who do never return. And if you see it, turn away. For once you set eyes upon it, it has already seen you. The legend does not end there. Some say that on nights when the ocean is unnaturally still, when even the waves seem to retreat in fear, a lone ship will appear on the horizon, shrouded in mist. It does not sail toward or away from any destination. It simply waits. The ship has no crew, no master, only shadows that move beneath its rotting deck. If a vessel dares to approach, its passengers will hear whispers, faint, almost like the ocean breeze, calling them by name. The longer they listen, the stronger the urge to step aboard. Those who do are never seen again. Some believe that Mercer is no longer the captain, that something far worse now commands the Black Veil. Others say that the ship itself is alive, feeding off the souls it lures in, growing stronger with each passing year. And still, it sails, forever cursed, forever hungry, lost between the realms of the living and the dead. If you ever find yourself on the open sea and the wind suddenly dies, leaving the ocean still as glass, listen closely. You may hear it calling for you next. Story 9. The Curse of the Skull Serpentress. There was a time when the city of Vorthos stood proud, a beacon of civilization and power. Its people thrived, its warriors were feared, and its temples reached toward the heavens in reverence of their gods. But greed and arrogance led to their downfall, for they worshipped false idols, and among them, the most terrible was Necthara, the Skull Serpentress. Legends told of a goddess who had once walked among men, her beauty unmatched, her gaze capable of bending the will of any mortal. But she was betrayed by the high priests of Vorthos, her shrines defiled, her name erased from the sacred texts. In their hubris, they cast her into the void, believing her power broken, her wrath extinguished. They were wrong. For centuries, her rage festered in the abyss, her hatred growing, her power twisting into something unholy. When the sky turned black and the ground split asunder, she returned, not as a goddess of beauty, but as a monstrous vision of death. Her body, once divine, had become an abomination. Her flesh had turned to stone, her face a grotesque skull, her eyes burning with an eternal fire of vengeance. From her head writhed serpents, each ending in a grinning, chattering skull, whispering the names of the damned. Her arms, elongated and clawed, could tear through stone, and from her fingertips poured an unnatural flame, a blend of blue and red, the fire of annihilation and rebirth. Her first act was to reclaim her city. The people of Vorthos had no time to flee. From the depths of the temples, she rose, her presence shattering the marble columns, turning the golden statues of false gods to dust. Those who gazed upon her in horror were doomed. Some petrified instantly, their bodies turning to macabre statues, their final expressions forever frozen in terror. Others fell to the serpents that coiled and struck like living vipers, their skull mouths devouring flesh, leaving only bones behind. But her true vengeance was far worse. The high priests, the ones who had betrayed her, did not die. No, their punishment was to serve. One by one, their skulls were ripped from their bodies, their flesh discarded, their screaming souls trapped forever within the heads of her writhing serpents. They chattered endlessly, their agony an eternal symphony that filled the night. Vorthos fell in a single night, its streets buried under a mountain of skulls, its rivers turned black with the blood of the fallen. No kingdom dared approach its ruins, for it was said that Nekhthara still wandered the desolation, hunting for those who bore the blood of the betrayers. Time passed, and yet the legend of Nekhthara did not fade. Travelers whispered of strange figures glimpsed on the horizon, of skeletal serpents slithering through the desert sands. Entire caravans vanished without a trace near the ruins, their remains found days later, bones picked clean, faces twisted in silent, eternal screams. Then came the scholars, a group of historians led by the ambitious doctor. James Calloway sought to uncover the truth behind the legend. They were armed with ancient maps, sacred relics, and the arrogance of men who believed themselves above the wrath of gods. They ventured into the ruins, their torches flickering against the darkened stone, their voices echoing through empty corridors where once prayers had been whispered. At first, they found nothing but silence, the remains of a lost city, its glory buried beneath centuries of dust and decay. But then, as night fell, the wind began to whisper. The scholars heard voices, faint at first, then rising into a cacophony of shrieks. The sand beneath them shifted, moving as if alive. The walls, once mere stone, seemed to pulse with something ancient and malevolent. And then they saw her. Nekhthara, standing at the heart of the ruins, her towering form wreathed in blackened flame, her skeletal face twisted into an unholy grin as her serpents snapped and hissed, their hollow eyes glowing with malice. One by one, the scholars fell. Some were turned to stone before they could even scream, their bodies now a permanent part of the ruins they sought to uncover. Others tried to flee, only to be ensnared by the writhing serpents, their skulls torn from their bodies to join Nekhthara's eternal chorus of the damned. Dr. Calloway was the last. He ran, his breath ragged, his mind unraveling as he stumbled through the cursed streets. The whispers surrounded him, whispering secrets of the void, of the endless hunger that could never be sated. As he reached the edge of the ruins, he felt the cold grip of claws on his shoulder. Nekhthara loomed over him, her face inches from his own, her voice a guttural rasp that echoed into his very soul. You will remember me, and through you, so shall they. His screams did not last long. Days later, a lone traveler stumbled into the nearest settlement, his eyes vacant, his skin cold. He spoke of horrors no mortal should have seen, of serpents that whispered, of a goddess of death that now walked the earth once more. But the most chilling part of his tale was what he had carved into his own flesh, deep into his arms, as if compelled by a force beyond his control. She sees you, she remembers you, and she is waiting. The traveler did not last the night. By morning, his body was gone, his footprints leading back into the desert. And when the wind howls through the shattered temples, the voices of the damned whisper with it, carrying a warning to all who would dare disturb the cursed city. No man who has entered the ruins has ever returned to tell the tale. Perhaps you will be the first, or perhaps you will be just another skull for the serpentress to claim. And this time, she does not plan to be forgotten. Story 10. The Bridge of the Damned. The legend of the Bridge of the Damned had been whispered through generations, a story told to frighten children and warn travelers. It was said to be a place where the boundary between the living and the dead had eroded, where the souls of the forgotten waited, their whispers carried by the wind. No one who had crossed it had ever returned to tell the tale. On a night when the moon was veiled in thick, suffocating clouds, Emily Carter and her younger brother Nathan found themselves standing before the bridge. They had been traveling through the countryside when their car broke down miles from the nearest town. With no other choice, they followed a dirt path through the forest, hoping it would lead them to safety. Instead, it led them to it. A decayed rope bridge stretched across an abyss of nothingness, its wooden planks weathered and rotting. The land beyond was obscured in a dense fog, but something about it felt wrong. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the trees around them twisted and skeletal, their bark carved with the names of those who had vanished. The wind howled through the chasm below, carrying voices, low, whispering, pleading. "We shouldn't go this way," Nathan muttered, gripping Emily's hand tightly. "Something's wrong." Emily hesitated, but behind them, the woods had grown unnaturally silent, as if the world itself had ceased to exist. The only path forward was the bridge. With cautious steps, they began to cross. Each plank creaked under their weight. The ropes swayed in a wind that did not touch them. As they moved further, the whispers grew louder, turning into disembodied voices, their words fragmented. "Turn back. It sees you. You should not be here." Emily's breath hitched. She turned to Nathan, but he had stopped walking, his gaze fixed on something ahead. Following his eyes, she saw it. A massive skull carved into the dark clouds, its hollow sockets staring at them, its jagged teeth stretching into an unnatural grin. The mist parted, revealing figures standing at the end of the bridge. Motionless, silent, their faces obscured by shadow. "Emily," Nathan whimpered, his voice trembling. "They're waiting for us." The figures did not move, yet the space between them and the siblings seemed to shrink. The bridge stretched longer behind them, the path they had taken now lost to darkness. The abyss below seemed to breathe. A deep, guttural voice rumbled through the sky. "Cross and be forgotten." Emily turned to run, pulling Nathan with her, but the bridge was no longer the same. The planks were slick with something warm, something that moved beneath their feet. The ropes curled like grasping fingers, tightening around their wrists, pulling them forward. Nathan screamed as his foot slipped, and Emily barely caught him. But he wasn't falling. He was being dragged by unseen hands, sinking into the bridge as if it were swallowing him whole. "Don't let go," he cried, his fingers clawing at the wood, his body half submerged in the bridge itself. The figures at the end of the bridge began to move toward them, their faces becoming clear. They were the missing, the ones who had crossed and never returned. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths twisted in silent, endless screams. Emily pulled with all her strength, but Nathan's body was sinking faster. "Please, help us," she sobbed, but the whispers only laughed. And then she saw it, her own name, carved into one of the planks. "You were always meant to cross," the voice whispered in her ear. "You were always meant to stay." The last thing Emily saw was Nathan's outstretched hand slipping beneath the wood, his final screams swallowed by the abyss. The bridge shuddered, the sky cracked open, and everything faded into the void. By morning, the bridge was empty once more. Some say if you stand at the edge of the chasm on a moonless night, you can still hear the cries of those who tried to cross. And if you look closely at the planks beneath your feet, you might see a name carved in the wood, your own. Because once the bridge calls for you, it never forgets. But this was not the end. Days later, search parties combed the area looking for Emily and Nathan. They found the car, still parked along the dirt road, untouched. Their footprints led to the bridge, but there was no sign of them. The only thing left was a small pendant belonging to Emily, resting at the entrance. Weeks passed, and more stories surfaced. Hikers, lost travelers, even a police officer who had gone looking for the missing siblings. None had returned. But something else was happening. People in nearby towns began having nightmares, visions of the bridge, of the abyss that lay beneath it. Some woke with strange symbols carved into their skin, as if by invisible hands. A local historian, Robert Wren, became obsessed with the legend. He pored through old records, searching for any clue to the bridge's origins. What he found was more horrifying than he could have imagined. The bridge had always been there. Long before the town was built, long before the land was even mapped, there were accounts of the bridge. Tribes spoke of it as a gate to the underworld, a place where lost souls were claimed. Those who ventured too close would hear the whispers, feel unseen eyes watching them. And those who crossed, they were never seen again. One night, driven by desperation and curiosity, Wren took a camera and ventured toward the bridge. He set up his tripod at the entrance, speaking into the recorder. "If anyone can hear this, I need you to understand. It's real. The stories are true. I don't know if I'll make it back, but I have to see what's beyond. I have to know." His last words were barely audible beneath the growing wind. "It's waiting for me." The next morning, his camera was found, still recording. The footage showed him walking onto the bridge, looking around, whispering something before vanishing mid-step. One frame caught his final moment, his face frozen in shock, as if he had seen something beyond comprehension. The bridge stood silent once more, waiting. And if you ever find yourself lost in the woods, if you stumble upon a chasm with a decayed rope bridge stretching across it, do not listen to the voices. Do not read the names on the planks. And whatever you do, never cross.